Chapter 20. Alexander remained seated on the edge of the bed, holding his son gently but firmly, as if afraid that letting go too quickly might somehow break the fragile reality of the moment. The dim night lamp cast a soft golden glow across the small room, illuminating Max's face as he studied his father with intensity. Almost as though he were memorizing every detail to make sure he was truly there, Alexander knew they did not have much time, but rushing Max now would be a mistake. So he lowered his voice and spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Max, listen to me, okay?" the boy acquiesced. "There are some people downstairs who might try to stop us from leaving this house," Alexander continued softly. "They think you should stay here, but I came to take you home." His voice softened, careful and steady so the child would not feel frightened. "You've been away for a long time, and Papa couldn't stay without you anymore." He brushed a strand of hair away from Max's forehead before continuing. "Home is where you belong with me, where your room is, where your toys are, where you can sleep without being scared." Max looked at him silently for a moment, his small fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his shirt. Alexander swallowed before asking gently, "Did you miss Papa?" Max bowed slowly. "I did sometimes at night," he admitted in a small voice. A faint smile flickered across Alexandra's face, though his eyes remained heavy with emotion. "I missed you too, every single day." Max looked down at the floor for a moment, thinking carefully the way children do when the world around them has suddenly become too big to understand. Then he looked back up. "Are we going home now?" he asked softly. Alexander acquiesced. "Yes, but we have to leave very quietly and very quickly, all right?" The boy hesitated for a second before asking the one question that had been sitting in his mind. "Will Mama come too?" Alexander paused, his expression tightening for the briefest moment before he answered carefully. "We'll figure that out later," he said gently. "Right now, Papa just needs to take you somewhere safe." Max's fingers tightened around the small toy car pillow he had been clutching. Alexander continued gently. "Things might get a little loud for a while. There might be shouting, maybe even some noises that sound scary." Max's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't interrupt. "But none of that is going to hurt you," Alexander said firmly, "because I'm going to be with you the whole time." He placed a hand on his shoulder. "You just need to do one thing for me." Max looked up. "Stay close to me, hold my hand, and be the brave boy I know you are." Max said nothing for a while. His small face was tense as he tried to process everything his father had said. Then Alexander asked quietly, "Do you trust your Papa?" Max looked at him for a long moment. Then he dipped. "Yes." Alexandra's chest tightened. "And will you be brave for me?" Max swallowed and straightened slightly. "I'll be brave." Alexander squeezed his hand gently. "Good boy." Max studied his face again, as if trying to decide whether to trust the promise hidden inside his father's words. Then he gave a small nod. "I want to go home," he said, "with you." This made Alexander tear up a little. Together they slipped off the bed. The hallway outside remained quiet. Alexander held Max's hand tightly as they moved towards the staircase, each step careful and controlled. The house still seemed asleep. For a brief moment, Alexander allowed himself to believe they might actually make it out quietly. But the moment they stepped into the main lounge downstairs, the lights exploded on, bright and unflinchingly white. Max flinched. Alexander froze. And suddenly they were no longer alone. Men stood around the room on all sides, rifles raised, their dark silhouettes emerging from the corners like darkness brought to life. 4. 6, 8. The exits were blocked. Max's small fingers tightened around Alexandra's hand. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from above. Alexander looked up. Layla stood on the staircase landing. Behind her stood several men, her brother, her father, and 2 of her cousins. Her father stepped forward slowly, his face hardened by cold anger. "Well," he said, "so this is how you plan to leave?" Alexander didn't answer. He pulled Max closer, positioning himself slightly in front of the boy. "You thought you could just walk into our house," the older man continued, his voice loud across the room, "and walk out with our child." Max buried his face against Alexandra's side. Alexander kept his gaze fixed on Layla, not the guns, not the men surrounding them, only on her. His voice was quiet. "Why did you need to do this to our son?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Layla's expression changed slightly. Something flickered in her eyes, discomfort, perhaps. She shook her head faintly. Before she could respond, her brother stepped forward sharply. "That is enough," he snapped. "You don't speak to her." Alexander ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Layla. "Was it worth it?" he continued quietly. Her father scoffed. "You have no right to question our decisions." Alexandra's voice grew sharper. "No right?" He gestured towards Max. "You kidnapped a child, you kept him hidden for months, you surrounded him with armed men like he was some kind of prisoner." "And for what?" Alexander demanded. "To sell Lumiere, to bargain with it, to offer it to foreign buyers who will turn it into whatever suits them." His voice rose slightly. "Was it money you wanted, influence, fame?" His gaze hardened. "You risked your own grandson's life for something so meaningless." That was when Layla finally snapped, her composure finally shattered. Her voice rose sharply, trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think I did all this for money?" she snapped. "For some stupid deal?" She shook her head violently. "No. I did it for him." Her eyes moved towards Max for a fleeting second before returning to Alexander. "You would have taken him away from me, I know you would have. One day you would have left with him and I would never see my own son again." Her words came faster now, years of fear spilling out unchecked. "So I protected him. I kept him where you couldn't take him from me, where he would stay with me." The room fell strangely quiet after her outburst. Now, Alexander understood the whole thing. This entire nightmare, months of hiding, the secrecy, the manipulation, had been built on a belief she had carried in silence. She had been convinced that he would steal Max away from her forever. The realization struck him with a dull weight, how deeply she had misunderstood him, how firmly she had believed the worst of him all along, but he said nothing. Alexander simply stood there, Max's small hand still locked tightly in his own, his eyes fixed on Layla as he absorbed the truth behind her confession. "Everything we did was for him." Her voice rang sharply across the room. She stepped forward on the staircase, her eyes blazing. "For his safety." Her words came out fierce and defensive. "You think I would let you keep dragging him into your world, away from me?" Her breathing grew uneven. "He belongs to me." The words came out almost like a demand. "I am his mother." Her eyes burned into Alexandra's. "And he will stay with me." The silence that followed was achingly sharp. Alexander stared at her for several seconds, then something in his expression changed. He wasn't angry or mad, he just looked like he didn't know who she actually was. "You're unrecognizable." His voice was almost gentle. "I don't know who you are anymore." Layla's face tightened. "Who is this person standing in front of me?" Alexander continued quietly. "Because the woman I married would never have done this." The words hit harder than any accusation. Layla's jaw trembled slightly, but before she could respond, a loud crash shattered the moment. Glass exploded inward from the rear window and chaos erupted. The explosion of glass was so loud it almost shocked the space. Several dark figures burst through the opening in a single coordinated movement. Malik and Karam with the rest of their members. The room erupted instantly. Men shouted, raising weapons in defense. Malik's voice cut sharply through the chaos. "Move." Gunfire erupted from Layla's side first. Malik had expected that. He had deliberately instructed his men not to fire unless absolutely necessary. The last thing they wanted was stray bullets near Max, but the other side had no such hesitation. Shots cracked through the air, splintering wood and shattering glass. Alexander reacted instantly. He pulled Max down behind an overturned table, shielding the boy with his own body. "Hands over your ears," he whispered urgently. Max obeyed immediately. His small hands pressed tightly against his head. The farmhouse erupted into chaos within seconds. Furniture crashed across the floor as men collided in violent struggle. A heavy wooden table overturned with a thunderous crack, chairs skidding across the tiles while bodies slammed into walls. The air filled with shouts, the sharp thud of fists, and the frantic scraping of boots against the floor. Karam moved first. With brutal precision, he seized one of the guards by the collar and struck him hard across the jaw, sending the man collapsing to the ground. Another guard lunged towards him from the side, but Karam twisted sharply, forcing the man backward until his body slammed violently into the wall behind him. Across the room, Malik cut through the chaos like he was waiting for this. He moved quickly, calmly, issuing short hand signals to the men who had stormed in behind him. His eyes constantly scanned the room, calculating every movement, every threat visible or not. For a few seconds, Alexander stood frozen in the middle of it, trying to understand the gravity of the whole situation. Then Malik's voice from earlier echoed clearly in his mind. If they discover you, don't fight them, don't wait, get to the backyard. That had always been the plan. Without hesitation, Alexander tightened his grip around Max's small hand. The boy's fingers curled instinctively around his father's as the violence unfolded around them. Stay close to me, Alexander whispered firmly. They began moving through the wreckage. Chairs lay overturned across the floor. Shattered glass from lamps, windows, tables flew here and there. Two men struggled violently beside the staircase, crashing into a cabinet that split open under the impact. Alexander guided Max carefully through the narrow spaces between the fighting bodies, shielding him with his own body. Suddenly, a man broke free from the chaos and lunged towards them from the side. Alexander reacted before he could even think. He shoved Max behind him and drove forward, slamming his shoulder hard into the attacker's chest. The man staggered backward, but Alexander didn't stop. He struck him again, this time with enough force to send the guard stumbling sideways into a fallen chair that collapsed beneath him. The path ahead cleared. Come on, Alexander urged quickly. They rushed toward the hallway that led to the back of the farmhouse. Behind them, the sound of gunfire suddenly tore through the room. A bullet ripped into the wall beside Alexandra's shoulder, spraying fragments of plaster across the corridor. The impact ringed violently through the narrow hallway. Max flinched at the sound, his body stiffening in fear, but he did exactly what his father had asked. He stayed silent, brave. Alexander tightened his grip on the boy's hand and pulled him forward. They ran. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly as shouts and gunfire continued behind them. Another shot rang out somewhere in the house, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Finally, the back door came into view. Alexander pushed forward with the last of his strength and threw the door open. The cold night air rushed inside instantly, sharp and biting against their skin as darkness spread out before them beyond the farmhouse. However, as soon as the fence came into view, Alexander froze, clutching Max's hand in a deadly grasp. Layla stood near the fence, her arm extended, the gun aimed directly at him. For a moment the world seemed to freeze, her eyes locked onto his. I knew you'd come this way, she said quietly, her voice trembled slightly. I know you too well. Alexander said nothing. Max stood beside him, silent. You don't have to do this, Alexander said finally. His voice was calm. You know this isn't right. Layla's grip on the gun tightened. You're taking him away from me. No, Alexander shook his head slowly. I'm taking him home. Her breathing became uneven. He's ours, Layla, Alexander continued softly. Both of ours. Max looked between them. I was never going to take him away from you. The words struck something inside her. He needs both of us. Alexandra's voice lowered, the anger in it fading into something far more tired and wounded. Layla, you were wrong about me, he said quietly. Not once have I ever thought about taking Max away from you. He is our son, yours and mine. How could you believe I would erase you from his life? His eyes stayed fixed on her, steady despite everything burning around them. I came here to take him home, not to steal him from you, but to bring him back to a life where he can have both his parents. I would never separate him from his mother, never. He stopped for a whole minute, said nothing more, letting the weight of those words settle between them. Then his gaze met hers, clearly showing the whirlpool of emotions he has felt for the past few months. I understand why you did this. I understand the fear that made you run to those people, the deals you made, the things you were willing to risk because you thought I would take him from you. He shook his head. Slowly. I see it now, I see what you were afraid of. His voice dropped even lower, but understanding it doesn't make it right, Layla. He gestured faintly towards Max, who stood pressed against him. Look at what this has done to him. The hiding, the running, the men with guns around him like this is normal. His jaw tightened. All of this because you believed I would steal our son from you. I never wanted to take him away from you. I only wanted him to grow up with both of us. That was always the plan, even when everything between us fell apart. Layla's fingers loosened, the gun slowly lowering. The weapon slipped from her hand. It hit the ground with a dull thud. And suddenly she collapsed to her knees, tears spilling down her face. "Max," she whispered, "come here." Max looked at Alexander. Alexander nodded gently. Max walked towards her. She wrapped her arms around him tightly. "I love you, Mama," Max whispered. Layla held him like she might never let go. "I love you too." Her fingers trembled against his back, clutching him with a desperate tenderness, while quiet sobs broke through her chest. The fear that had been driving her slowly unraveled, replaced by an overwhelming flood of relief, guilt, and love as she buried her face in his hair and held him as though he were the only thing anchoring her to the world. Then they heard footsteps pounding rapidly across the yard, breaking the fragile silence that had settled after Layla released the gun. Her brothers were rushing towards them, their faces burning with fury the moment they saw Alexander standing there with Max. Alexander reacted before they could even close the distance. In one swift movement, he bent down, grabbed the gun that had slipped from Layla's hand, and raised it toward them. "Stop right there," he warned sharply. The sudden command froze them mid-step. For a brief second, no one moved. Taking advantage of that hesitation, Alexander lifted Max quickly into his arms and stepped back towards the fence. The boy clung tightly to his neck as Alexander vaulted over it in one determined motion. On the other side, Malik stood beside their waiting car as though he had been expecting the exact moment Alexander would appear. He gave a small, approving nod when he saw Max safe in his arms. "Well done," Malik said calmly. Alexander barely had time to catch his breath. "Go," he said quickly, urgency tightening his voice. Malik gestured towards the car. "Karam and the others will handle the rest." "We need to move." They rushed inside the vehicle, the doors slamming shut just as the engine roared to life. The car tore across the open countryside, gravel scattering beneath the tires as the dark plains stretched endlessly ahead of them. Max sat pressed against Alexander in the back seat, while the men in front scanned the road and the mirrors with sharp concentration. Within seconds, bright headlights appeared in the distance behind them, rapidly closing the gap. "They're coming," one of the men muttered. Malik glanced calmly into the rear-view mirror, watching the cluster of vehicles racing after them across the empty plains. Instead of concern, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. He turned slightly toward Alexander, who was still holding Max protectively. "Looks like our friends don't want to say goodbye," Malik remarked lightly. Then he gave a small, almost playful wink. "And now for my next trick." Reaching into the console, he pressed a small remote trigger. Seconds later, the night behind them erupted. Explosions thundered across the plain, violent bursts of fire tearing through the darkness as the pursuing vehicles were caught in the blast. Flames burst into the air behind them, and the force of the explosions shook the ground like distant thunder. One of the cars spun violently off the road, and another disappeared into a cloud of smoke and debris. Inside the speeding vehicle, the glow of the explosions flickered across their faces as they continued racing forward into the night. Behind them, the countryside burned with scattered fire and smoke, the sound of the blasts fading slowly as the car disappeared deeper into the darkness.